Hey everybody, welcome. This is video 6 in our series on the Catholic theological tradition. And we're in the patristic era, the era of the fathers of the church. And we just discussed two apostolic fathers, Clement and Ignatius of Antioch. Now we're going to shift. You can read about other of the apostolic fathers in When the Church Was Young, Voices of the Early Fathers. But we don't have time to discuss them in class, but we do have to discuss this next figure and this next group of figures, because we're passing now into the middle of the 2nd century. We're no longer in a time when people are writing and teaching who were alive during the time of the apostles. It's the next generation. And now begins something very new and very fresh and something very exciting. We don't have living contact with the apostles, person firsthand anymore, but we do have our people being called to Christ who are going to speak to the culture. They're going to speak not just to the Christian community, but to the world. And they know the world. They have been schooled in the ways of philosophy and in culture. They're educated. They're educated beyond rabbinic Judaism like Paul. They're educated culturally. We don't know how much Paul knew about Stoicism and Plato and Aristotle, but the figures we're going to talk about now, the apologists and controversialists, we know that they were schooled in the Greek and Roman classics. And without having been schooled in those, they wouldn't be able to converse very intelligently with the emperor. And they dared to write to the emperor and to pagans to make a defense of Christianity. First, I want to just say defense. Where does that idea come from? That's what the word apology means. An apologist is someone who makes a defense. An apologia is a defense, not an apology in the sense of I'm sorry, but a defense of something or someone. Plato wrote the apology of Socrates. The defense of his character. That's one of his dialogues. So here we find Christians picking up this use, this Greek idea. They actually also saw it in Paul. Paul makes two apologies or defenses of his faith in Acts. One before Jews in Jerusalem, and then before Festus and Agrippa in Caesarea. If you come with me to the Holy Land for credit as a CDU, Catholic Distance University student, you can actually make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and get credit for it. We go to Caesarea and we read right in the place that Paul makes his defense, we read his defense right from the words of the book of Acts. But anyway, this idea of defense is now taken up by people in the middle of the 2nd century. Actually, one of the apostolic fathers is the first to write an apology addressed to the pagan world, to someone in the pagan world. We don't have time to read it, but please read the letter to Diognetus. That's the very first Christian apology after Paul. But next, we need to talk about someone who, far and away, I think, is the most important of those who address apologies to the pagan world, and that is Justin Martyr. Let's talk a little bit about who he is, first of all, and his story, and then we'll talk about his teaching. Number one, Justin is born in the Holy Land. You've heard of Nablus. It's in the news. It's in the Palestinian West Bank, and there's trouble there from time to time, and that's why it's in the news. But Nablus is just a corrupted form of the word Neapolis, which means, in Greek, new city. It was a new Roman city, Greco-Roman pagan city that was built in Samaria, and it didn't have Jews in it, it had pagans. And so Justin is born there, probably around the year, perhaps 110 or something like that. He is born in Samaria, and he decides he's going to become a scholar. A philosophy scholar, a philosopher. And in those days, a philosopher is not just a scholar, but he gathers a group of disciples. He's like a guru, and he actually wears a distinctive cloak. Clergy didn't wear distinctive garb out on the street, but philosophers did. So you know a philosopher by his garb, by his cloak, and you could go and ask to be his disciple and take lessons from him. So anyway, Justin becomes a philosopher. And we don't know where this happens, but one day he's walking along a seacoast, and he tells the story. And the seacoast could be the Mediterranean, could be the Sea of Galilee, who knows. But he's walking along the coast, and he's reading a philosopher out loud. In those days, you really didn't read silently. When you read out loud. just a custom. So he's reading out loud, and a man walks up behind him, overhears, and says, "Pardon me, but I hear that you're reading. You have a philosopher's cloak on. You're reading this problem from Plato. Let me talk to you. You must love wisdom." "Oh, yes, I'm a lover of wisdom. That's what philosopher means." "Well, have you ever heard about the true wisdom? Did you ever hear about the Jewish prophets? You said you grew up in that area." He said, "Well, I've never really read those Jewish prophets." He said, "Well, they write about someone who was born not far from where you were born. He was born maybe 70 years, 80 years before you, maybe 100 years before you. All the prophecies of these Jewish sages all converge on him." And so he gets the attention, this old man gets the attention of Justin, and Justin starts reading the Old Testament prophets. And he starts getting intrigued with this figure of Christ, and hears about the Christian message. He has seen Christians martyred in the arena, and they've given him inspiration by their death. And we'll find this a number of times, that Christians publicly dying in the arena actually provoke curiosity, because they didn't die like other people died. They didn't die cursing and screaming and in fear. They died nobly, attending to each other, huddled together, maintaining their dignity to the end. And that inspired Justin. So anyway, Justin ends up enrolling in what we now call RCIA, the catechumenate, and he becomes a Christian. He's baptized. And instead of taking off the philosopher's cloak, instead of saying, "I was an error looking for wisdom in Plato and all these others," no, he keeps the cloak on because he's a true philosopher. He's found true wisdom. Christ is honored in the ancient church as under the title of Holy Wisdom, the personification, the embodied, incarnated wisdom spoken about in the book of wisdom, in Proverbs. So anyway, the word is also wisdom. So he now feels like he's entitled finally to the philosopher's cloak, and he wants to go where he can drink from the apostolic tradition. He comes from Palestine, but he goes to Ephesus. Ephesus is an heir to the Pauline tradition, to the tradition of John. The rumor is that John died there in Ephesus. In fact, that's where his tomb is reputed to be. The Basilica of St. John the Apostle is in ruins there. But anyway, he goes there. But he wants to go to Rome, to the city of Peter and Paul, so he goes there. So this is a guy who's drunk from the apostolic tradition in Palestine, because that's what it was called, by the way. In the 2nd century, it was named Palestine as a Roman province distinct from Syria. So that's where the name comes from. So he grew up there in that province, the province originally of Jesus and the apostles. Then he goes to Ephesus, another apostolic center. Finally, he goes to Rome. And he's bold. At the time, the church is underground, in the sense that it's not public. It's a capital crime to be a Christian. And although there's not constant, intense, systematic persecution, at any moment you could lose your property or your life. So people didn't publicly come out, and tell everyone they're Christian, except Justin. Justin not only told people he was Christian, he invited anybody who wanted to come to his house. And he set up his house as a seminar room, and anybody could learn publicly about Christianity in his home. And then he decides, if that's not brazen enough, to write publicly a letter to the emperor, an apology. And he writes a second. So there's 2 apologies or defenses of the faith addressed to the emperor, publicly written by Justin. And the only other thing we have from him that survived, because he wrote a lot, but we lost a lot of it. What survived was also a dialogue with a Jewish wise man named Trypho. So we have 3 documents that survive from this time. He wrote them around 150 AD, and they're remarkable. First and foremost, I'm going to talk about the reason that he has to make this defense. Of course, Christians are being killed, but why are the Romans killing them? Do they hate Christ? No, they really don't care about Christians worshiping Christ. The real problem they have with Christians at this point is there's 3 problems. One is these Christians are atheists. The next is they're immoral. They have orgies. And the next is they're incestuous orgies. And they're cannibals. They eat the flesh and blood of some man at their orgies named Christus. So idolatry, immorality, and cannibalism. These are the crazy notions that, it's not idolatry, it's atheism. Atheism the problem of immorality and cannibalism. These are the three charges leveled against Christians. So obviously they're incorrect. Why did the Romans call them atheists? Because they wouldn't worship the Roman gods. And for God's sake, whoever you want to worship, the Romans said, worship them, but you gotta pay honor to Jupiter and to Minerva and to Juno. Okay, you can't, and Mars, you got it, because if you don't, they're going to get ticked off and we're going to have problems. So every time problems happen like natural disasters, people would blame Christians. The gods are angry because we're tolerating these people in our midst who are so disrespectful, they won't even throw some incense on an altar to these guys. So we've got to punish them, and then the gods will relent. And the other reason is that by this point in time, Caesar is being honored as a god. And obviously nobody really takes this seriously, except maybe Caesar. No one thinks he's truly a god, but for God's sake, you got to go along with him, make him feel good, burn incense to his image. So the Christians wouldn't do any of these things, and so they were called atheists. Okay? And when they were martyred, people would yell, "Away with the atheists." We know this from another apostolic father, Polycarp, whose martyrdom is recounted. An eyewitness writes a document that's a gem. We don't have time in this class to go over it, but the martyrdom of Polycarp, you ought to read it, ought to read about it in When the Church Was Young. But anyway, the other problem is, cannibalism, obviously. They heard about the Christians having love feasts where the Christians loved the brothers and sisters and ate the flesh of a man named Jesus. So that shows you how important the Eucharist is, that Romans heard about it and heard it wrong. They misinterpreted what they heard. Okay, so Justin lays out, he addresses each of these things. And what's amazing is the Eucharist is hidden. It's something that even Christian converts who are not yet baptized can't fully attend. Nowadays, if you watch, RCIA candidates are dismissed after the homily. Well, that's the way it was in the early church. People could come to the liturgy of the word, but they leave. And the prayer of the faithful is called the prayer of the faithful because only those baptized and confirmed could exercise the priestly task of together interceding for the needs of the church and the world. So those who weren't yet faithful weren't allowed to be there. So anyway, this is fascinating because what we see in Justin decides to break the secrecy of Christian liturgy and to try to get rid of these crazy misconceptions. He's going to clearly say what goes on in baptism and in the Eucharist, but he's speaking to a pagan audience, so he's not using just Christian lingo. He's trying to translate it for them. And he explains what the Eucharist is like. And if you read this account of the Eucharist in Justin's first apology, you will see the Novus Ordo of the new Mass of Vatican II, which is not new, it's old. It goes back to Justin. It goes back to Hippolytus in the late second, early third century. So even the second Eucharistic prayer that we have comes from Hippolytus's Eucharistic prayer, a Greek prayer that was lost until the beginning of the 20th century. So Justin, he was not known at the time of the Council of Trent. When Trent revised the liturgy, couldn't make use of Hippolytus, couldn't make use of Justin. But the Second Vatican Council did. So you'll see how the Eucharist, as we celebrate it today in the ordinary form of the Roman Mass, is just following the outline of the Mass of Rome in around 150 AD. First, you have readings from the Scriptures for as long as time allows. Then the president of the assembly, he also mentions that there's readings from the memoirs of the apostles. This is an indication that now New Testament, what we now call the New Testament, that some of those things, letters of Paul, Gospels are being read. He doesn't say Gospels, he doesn't say Paul, he just says the memoirs of the apostles. Then he says, the one presiding over the assembly gives an exhortation for as long as time allows. Then we take up a collection. What's the collection for? For the widows and the orphans, to sustain them. Then, then he talks about the prayer of the faithful, the Eucharistic prayer, the long prayer of thanksgiving. He talks about the consecration, and he says something he talks about, everything, the sign of peace is in there, everything is in there. And you find what's amazing is really what he says about the Eucharist. he says it would have been really easy to say this is just a symbol. You know, all this stuff you hear about cannibalism, forget that. It's just simple, just bread and wine. But he says that after the invocation, we have received, and that's a word, we have received from tradition. It's been passed on to us. That the bread and the wine is no more common bread and wine, but becomes the flesh of the incarnate Jesus for our transformation. Very strong statement of Eucharistic realism. Is it transubstantiation? Nah. Transubstantiation is developed in terms of that language later. Justin doesn't use that language, but that fact that the elements are transformed and in some very meaningful way really are the flesh and blood of Christ, and that this makes an impact on our life, changes us, that's all right there. And it's important. It would have just been very, very easy to emphasize it's only a symbol. That would have gotten him off the hook very, very well and easily. But he tries to explain what it means to eat the flesh and blood of this man called Jesus in the Eucharist. Very powerful. We also see in baptism is in the name of the three persons, and it's known as the enlightenment or the illumination. That is something we see continuously in the early church. We didn't have time to read the Didache, at least in class. You're supposed to read it though. But the Didache also shows baptism in the name of the three persons, not in the name of Jesus only. Very interesting in terms of sacramental practice. But something else that I want to point out here is the Apostolic Fathers don't make a creative contribution really to the tradition. They pass on the tradition. They're witnesses of the tradition. With Justin, we see the beginnings of this creative function of the Fathers. They help to shape the tradition and give it its classic form. They help creatively to explain things. They deal with the problem of Christ and culture. What we saw in Ignatius is the beginning of a bad approach to Christ and culture by the Docetists, people who are more Greek than they are biblical, who import ideas from Greek and Near Eastern paganism into Christianity, denying the fleshiness of the body of Jesus. Okay, so that's culture being allowed to corrupt the gospel. But what we see here is that there's a middle road. You have to be able to make points of contact with the culture, and you also got to be able to incorporate what's good in the culture into the Catholic tradition, into the theological tradition, into worship, into life. And so that's challenging, and who does that for the first time that we know of, at least in writing, that we have survival, to pour over and study? It's Justin. So Justin is encountering culture. He's already a cultured man before he's a Christian, and he's speaking to the culture publicly. So he deals with this problem of Christ and culture, and I'm just going to say, remember that Docetism in Ignatius? Well, that Docetism has turned into something that is called Gnosticism. Now it's still a widespread tendency. It's not just one thing, one organized thing. It crops up with a number of different leaders and teachers. But Gnosticism not only denies the physicality of the body of Jesus, it sees salvation as being our ability to escape this world after we die and make it back to some place in the highest heaven where we came from. I mean, do you ever feel like you don't belong in this world? That somehow you don't fit? Well, that's because you don't. See, unlike the other ordinary people out there who are just really very, very dull and very, very dense and very, very fleshy, you have a spark of the divine in you that got trapped in a body by mistake. It was a horrible mistake. And after you die, after these people die, they're just going to be nothing. After you die, you have a shot. Your spirit has to make its way back to the highest heaven. But there's all sorts of evil demigods in between, and you need knowledge to navigate by them. And so a heavenly messenger has come to give us these passwords to get by these blockers, to get out of the realm of the lower darkness and the lower air to the higher realms where light is, the realms of light. And so Christian Gnostics made Jesus this figure who descends from heaven. He didn't die for us. He came to bring us hidden knowledge. Anyway, this crazy form of Christian heresy, Gnosticism, was very widespread in the mid-2nd century. It was the biggest battle that had to be faced. And this corrupts Christianity by just making Christianity. It takes the veneer of Christianity, puts it over a pagan system. That's a sellout of Christ to culture. All right? So, it's helpful to know about Gnosticism, this elitism for the chosen few who are special and better than everybody else, and the body being bad and being of no avail and pointless. The idea of salvation by knowledge. Jesus is a guru. By the way, all the Gospels that didn't make it into the canon are all proven by philology to the science, remember, that we talked about in the earlier class? Philology has proven that those Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary Magdalene, etc., they are not from the 1st century. The Gospels that we have in the 4 Gospels, they are from the 1st century. Philology proves that. You don't have to be a person of faith. It's just a historical fact. So the Gnostic Gospels, all these Gospels, other than the 4 that are in the canon, are from the 2nd century, and they all omit the cross. No Gnostics believed in Jesus' incarnation or in his passion. So they're not there. All we find in the Gnostic Gospels is a guru. A dreamy-eyed guru who gives us very quizzical statements, and these quizzical statements are going to give us the knowledge to get back to the realms of light after we die. That's what Gnosticism was about. Why are they not in the canon? Clearly, they don't belong there, and the early church knew they didn't belong there. But let's go back to Justin, all right? But before we go to Justin, let's go to Tertullian. He's going to come next, but I have to talk about him here. The Gnostics sold out Christ to culture. Tertullian takes the opposite approach. He says in one of his famous pithy statements, and he's full of them, he says, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" In other words, philosophy, we don't need philosophy, we have the prophets. They're totally distinct and opposed. So actually, in real practice, Tertullian uses the wisdom of the ancient world in which he was schooled, but he denies it. And he rejects it. And he ends up joining a rigorous sect later in his life that's very hardcore and really dies outside the bosom of the church. So Justin takes this middle road. Remember, there's this, so often there are polar opposites. Heresies tend to take extreme forms. All right, so the Catholic approach is always to take that approach that's not just moderation, but it's really what I call with in this case, it's critical assimilation. Here's what Justin does. First of all, there's plenty of ancient paganism that he totally rejects. Morality, for example, okay? Polytheism, for example. He rejects the myths of the pagan fables and the myths of the gods and the crazy ideas of the gods that you find in Homer, where the gods are really playing tricks on each other, they're cheating on each other, they're cheating on people, they're lying, they're scheming. They're no more virtuous than bad people. They're just more powerful. They're people with all the foibles of people just writ large, and they can't die. That's it. So Justin ridicules that. And he ridicules also pagan morality. In those days, they didn't have the technology that we have. They didn't have contraceptives that were 100% effective. Well, actually, today contraceptives aren't 100% effective. But they also didn't have surgical abortion as well perfected as we have it. They did try surgical abortion. They were actually successful from time to time. And they used drugs that were successful from time to time. When abortion was not successful, with unwanted children, what do? They expose them to the elements, either to die from the weather or to be picked up. In many, many cases, they would be picked up by brothels raised for prostitution. Horrible sex trafficking in the ancient world. So prostitution, now the thing that Justin says, he says, you call us immoral? I mean, we have people in our midst who have lived continents, have lived celibacy for years, their whole life. So he's a witness to the beauty of celibacy, and he brags about it because he knows that the pagans a lot of times admire self-restraint, but they are incapable of it. So to see people who are happy and celibate, that's a witness. It's something powerful is happening here. But also, he says, we share our board, but not our bed. We share our belongings with each other, but we don't share our spouses. we're faithful until death with one spouse. And he says, you people, on the other hand, you accuse us of incest? No, you're the people, you have constantly going to prostitutes, and who knows, they may be your own relatives because you and your family have fathered children who've been abandoned and now are, grown up in brothels. So you're the people who are committing this horrible crime of incest. So we find out that the ancient world, right now, the paganism of our culture is just nothing new. It's not progress. The sexual revolution just went back to the paganism of Rome and Greece in terms of sexual ethics. Okay? It's just that they at least prized the idea of families staying together. So people are unfaithful, men particularly, to their spouses and playing around with boys and with other women. But on the other hand, they at least maintain family. Today it's a free-for-all, but we're just going back to the paganism, including the homosexuality and pedophilia, which is coming right down the pike, folks. But anyway, these kinds of things are they were back there in the ancient world. Now, the early church knew that it was called to a distinct lifestyle. It didn't accommodate to the sexuality of the age as many Christians are accommodating now. It was very clear that we are a counterculture when it comes to morality. We can't accept pagan morality, but there is wisdom that has come from the mouth of pagan thinkers. So this is where we see a critical assimilation. We reject a lot of pagan culture, but there's elements of the culture where we can make contact. Now, Paul did this when he went to Athens in Acts 17, and he says, I see you worship an unknown God, and you are very right to do so, and I've come here to tell you about him. One of your thinkers said, in him we live and move and have our being. So Paul is making contact and seeing that there's something noble here amidst the paganism. There's something true here. And so our friend Justin had found that truth to some degree before he found the fullness of truth in Christ. So he makes contact with that truth. He accepts the valid insights of Greco-Roman philosophy. The idea that the Stoics and the Greeks had, that there's a unity to the world. There's a divine intelligibility. The whole world is held together by reason with a capital R. The Word. In the beginning of John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, Justin helps make contact with the idea of the Logos, the Word, who is this divine principle of intelligibility that keeps the whole world operating as a one beautiful, magnificent system. What makes it all make sense? It's the Logos, the divine Word. Well, that divine Word, the seeds of that Word are present. And that's what he calls them. Seeds of that Word are present in Plato, in other thinkers. And so that is to be honored, and that is to be recognized. So for him, Socrates, in his wisdom and his ethical wisdom, is a Christian in a certain way before Christ. And this is really the idea that you find, sounds like a modern liberal idea. This is an idea of a man who died for his faith in the 2nd century. One of the greatest martyrs of the 2nd century and apologists, Justin Martyr. This is nothing new whatsoever. He even asked questions. Why did Plato get so much right? In one place, he says, it's because Plato plagiarized the prophets. He didn't give them credit. He stole stuff from them. Nowadays, in a scholarly way, we examine this hypothesis, and it does not seem to hold any water whatsoever. So I think he was wrong there. But this is where he says that those who live in accord with reason, those who live in accord with the Logos, are living in accord with Christ. So that's where the idea comes from. That's a better, more fruitful idea that's followed in the history of Christianity, followed by Vatican II, followed by Father Karl Rahner, who is a theologian, and you may disagree, and I disagree with some things that Karl Rahner has said. But on the other hand, his idea of people who are Christians who don't explicitly know Jesus, this whole idea in the Second Vatican Council, that people can be possibly saved without having heard the gospel if they respond to the promptings of grace in their soul to seek the truth where it may be found, insofar as it's possible for them to find it. And even some of them worship God, even though they don't have an accurate picture of God, that these folks are related to, they're ordered to the church. It says that in Lumen Gentium. Well, that idea comes right out of Justin, it's a recovery of this great element in our tradition. Now, what did other thinkers do with this idea that we have to make contact with pagan culture and we can accept a lot of the good stuff from pagan culture? It's got to be a critical acceptance. We've got to keep at the door everything that's opposed to the cross of Christ, but welcome whatever is useful. That idea is picked up in Alexandria, in a fantastic catechetical school that is developed there. Around the year 180, 185 is the first sign of this school, run by a layman, Clement of Alexandria. And that school didn't just teach religion, it taught all the disciplines that could possibly help us to explain the truth to the cultured world. So they learned mathematics, and they learned geometry and astronomy, and they learned all sorts of things, literature. They were incredibly cultured in the catechetical school. Preparing people to be Christians was preparing them, reading the Old Testament, preparing morally, knowing salvation history, but also acquiring the tools to be evangelists, to be dialoguers with the modern world. So Origen, the next director of that school, we're going to hear about him later, but he's used the beautiful analogy of the Jews coming out of Egypt and taking the gold of the Egyptians with them. He said, the wisdom that whatever good that we find that is rich in pagan culture belongs to us. That gold of the Egyptians we need to take on our journey to the kingdom of God, to the promised land. Beautiful analogy. Okay, so this is a widespread analogy, and it's a characteristic of authentic Catholic theology, is not an uncritical acceptance of the latest fad and latest intellectual trend, but dialogue and a critical assimilation of whatever is good. And we're going to see this time and time again as we go through history. Okay, how about Justin when it comes down to his Christology, his teaching about Jesus? How about the Trinity? You know, these are big issues, doctrinal issues in the first few centuries. So where did Justin fall on these issues? Well, first of all, you see a clear affirmation in his apology that Jesus is God. So that equation's made. Jesus is God. And clearly, the Son is distinct from the Father. In his mind, it is the Word that speaks to Moses in the burning bush in Exodus 3, not the Father. So there's a distinction between the Word and the Father. It's not just one person or the same person. Okay. Also, Jesus and the Holy Spirit are worshipped, as is the Father. So again, we see an elemental Trinitarianism. But we also see something. He's talking to a pagan now in his apology. He's talking to a pagan who doesn't understand the fine points of theology. So what Justin actually thinks about this, we're not sure. But he describes the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as three ranks. The Father in the first rank, the Son in the second, the Spirit in the third. Now, this could be heretical or developed in heretical direction. That the Father is truly God, the Son is God in a secondary sense, and the Spirit is God in a tertiary sense. That's one possible interpretation. That's the interpretation taken by the heretic Arius around the year 310, okay? But so this could lend itself to what we call subordinationism, but not necessarily, because in Orthodox Trinitarian theology, the Father has a preeminence. The Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox, are very strong in this. It doesn't mean he has a greater divine nature. It's the same divine nature. But the Father is in a very special way the one from whom the whole Trinity proceeds. The Son receives his being eternally from the Father. The Son's from the Father through the Son. Okay, but so the Father is the origin and source of the whole divinity. This is developed Trinitarian theology. It's a very strong idea in the East. It could be what he's saying. We don't know, because he doesn't connect all the dots. He doesn't explain himself. It's not explicit. His Trinitarianism here in this apology and the three things we have from him are somewhat implicit, hazy, imprecise. Okay, and that's part of what the fathers do. That's why they're creative. They help make things clearer and more precise. They develop terminology that help us to clarify these challenging mysteries. The mysteries that can never be fully understood, but can be much more adequately expressed than the way the heretics want to express these mysteries. So that's it for Justin. Next, we're going to see another apologist in our next video in the Catholic theological tradition.
you.